I'm learning history in Cleveland, Tennessee. Ocoee Society, 5 Points Museum.
Welcome to the Curious Curators podcast with your hosts, Hope Vollm, Lindsay Shirkey, and Elijah Hammonds. Today we're going to talk about plagues and pandemics. Well, things are getting crazy out there.
Hi guys, welcome back to the Curious Curators. I'm Hope.
I'm Elijah.
And I'm Lindsay.
And today on the Curious Curators, we are going to be diving into a topic about plagues, epidemics, pandemics, global disease, all sorts of things, sickness. And so this is going to be the sickest podcast you've ever listened to in your whole life.
10 out of 10.
But just a precursor is that we have a huge list of all sorts of podcasts that we want to do, topics and things that we wanted to talk about. And this was on that list several weeks ago, and it was chosen then, and we are filming this podcast in the midst of a large pandemic. So it is topical for sure, but we want to talk about more of the historical impacts of plagues, pandemics, and all of these diseases, and past plagues. So, Hope, could you go ahead and just start us off with some definitions?
Sure thing. So, a plague is kind of defined pretty basically as an epidemic or pandemic of infectious disease, or also a swarm of pests or insects, but we're going to go with the first definition for this. And then an epidemic means that a disease has spread rapidly to a large number of people in a given population or area. And this usually happens within about 2 weeks. So we're talking about like in a city or even a small country. And then a pandemic means that it's an epidemic of disease that actually spreads across a large region, which could be multiple continents or worldwide. So some of the ones that we're going to talk to you about today were pandemics, some were epidemics, and some were actually plagues. So where should we start, guys?
Well, I guess we could start with some of the earliest known plagues that are recorded. One of the ones that I did some research on was the Plague of Cyprien. I kind of feel bad because Saint Cyprian was the bishop of Carthage who recorded information about this plague, and so the plague was named after him.
Yikes.
Poor guy. What a job.
Yeah, what a legacy to leave. This was from 249 to 262 CE, which is AD. The agent was unknown, like they didn't know if it was smallpox, influenza, or a viral hemorrhagic fever like Ebola. But they say that at the height of the outbreak, 5,000 per day were dying in Rome. And I have this really great quote. All were shuddering, fleeing, shunning the contagion, impiously exposing their own friends, as if with the exclusion of the person who was sure to die of the plague, one could exclude death itself also.
Oh my gosh.
And that's from Pontius of Carthage. He was a deacon under Cyprian of Carthage.
So they were pretty friendly people. They were just, go ahead and take my pal.
Yeah,
it's fine.
selling out their friends because they thought if they sold them out that the plague would end and they would also not get the plague.
Oof.
That's a ton of people a day, though. It's crazy to think that many people a day could die in a city and it would still continue to function.
Well, and the thing about some of these older epidemics and plagues is, how long they lasted. I mean, that was from 249 to 262.
Yeah, that's...
Jeez.
That was more than 10 years.
Was that only in, you said that was only in Rome?
That was in essentially the Roman Empire at the time.
Gotcha, which was
Carthage,
stretching all over.
Rome, places like that, yeah.
Yeah. Dang.
And that was probably... Do they know how that was carried around? Probably trade routes.
They don't know
all
what it
roads
was,
led
though.
to Rome as well, so if
Right.
that was the case, you could just sort of...
But they don't know what it was, since they don't know if it was influenza or smallpox or like something like Ebola, hemorrhagic fever, then, it's kind of hard to tell the method of transmission if we don't know what it was.
So for these, for the very old ones at least, they just kind of describe the symptoms, and like modern day, like epidemiologists maybe would look at it and say these symptoms could have been this, or that.
Yeah.
So a lot of I think that's really interesting that you can still like find those writings and everything and just kind of figure things out, but also a little bit terrifying because, like I said, that's a lot of people. So I have an interesting one that I actually found out about from a television show and then found out that it was real. So this one is called the sweating sickness, or the English sweat. And I'm not sure if anyone ever watched the fantastic show The Tudors, but it was in there, which is how I found out about it, and then I looked it up.
I watched about one episode, and then I decided that Henry VIII was too good looking for me to believe the show.
Yeah, he was kind of stunning. I actually was obsessed with that show for a very long time. Actually, I might just go watch it later. That's actually my plan for the day.
Self-quarantine, Hope.
Yes, that's what I'm going to do, actually. So this one was, like, multiple outbreaks happened from about 1485 to 1551, and they normally happened in summer or autumn. And this is another one where they don't even know what it was. We are not sure still, but there are a couple of things that, like, kind of denote that you have this sickness. And once I start talking about it, I kind of wonder, like, would it just cause mass hysteria anyway? So it started with a sense of apprehension. That was it. That was the first time.
I'm in trouble. I have sweating sickness.
So, like, that's my life all the time. I live in a constant, like, state of apprehension. So, but then it followed you with, like, cold shivers, giddiness, headache, severe neck and body pain, exhaustion.
Giddiness.
Like, yeah.
Well, you said you were giddy this morning.
I know,
so
and I have
I think you've got sweating sickness coming on.
I
Yeah,
have
you're
a
checking
severe
off the
sense
whole
of
list.
apprehension as well.
We better not do that. You're kind of a hypochondriac.
I really
Let's
am.
not worry you.
But I'm not sure that I could go to the doctor and be like, I think I have the sweating sickness from 1500.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you started sweating. That was like a sense of heat, a headache, delirium, intense thirst, and then you just kind of like fell asleep.
Do they have any, like, suspects for what this could have been?
Yes. So it could have been that it was bad sanitation that just made everyone sick. It could have been
Okay.
contaminated water, which is like cholera-y, but that doesn't sound like the symptoms of cholera to me. But then it could have been some, like, kind of relapsing fever caused by
You made
ticks or
cholera
lice.
an adjective.
Yeah,
I really
noticed
did.
that.
Guys, I have a skill for things like that. It also could have been hantavirus, which is a lung ailment, or even anthrax poisoning.
Oh, okay.
And I was a little bit confused about this, about anthrax poisoning in general, and I talked to Elijah about it across the room one day, because I was remembering the more recent anthrax outbreaks.
Powder.
Yeah, where it was just a powder that you could rub on things. But apparently it's a bacterial infection caused by, like, coming into contact with spores of anthrax itself, and, like, cattle herders and stuff would get that, and then I guess it just got widespread. But, yeah, that was kind of... And that wasn't really, I mean, considering, like, the Plague of Cyprien was so long ago. Like, this was recorded history as well, like, quite, like, Henry VIII time. I almost made that an adjective, too, so I stopped myself.
Quite Henry VIII.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So I managed
was
to
there
stop it.
ever any deaths from that?
So there were a ton of deaths. People were basically just, like, dying in the streets, and they had, you know, plague pits and the like for them, but they never found out what it was, and it just went away. Just went away one day in, I guess, around 1551. That was the last outbreak. And this happened in England as well as Europe, but it wasn't, like, all at the same time everywhere. But I think it hit cities extremely hard, so cities like London were kind of in trouble then.
Yeah.
But I think we will kind of see that a lot in a lot of things.
Oh,
like
yeah. London was apparently just a terrible place to be when it comes to
sanitation.
plagues,
everything.
which, you know, came
Just
from
us.
poor sanitation. And, you know, a lot of times, like, the smaller religious communities, I think, like, Quakers and Jews and Muslims didn't get these as much because they have hygienic practices that are within their religious beliefs.
Oh, I didn't think of that.
Yeah, so it was actually something about the plague that I was... I was watching a documentary about the plague, and it was talking about how, like, Jews and Quakers in London were less likely to get it. But part of that was they have, like, sanitation practices that are within their religious dogma, I guess.
If you ever needed a reason to wash your hands or take a shower, we are giving it to you right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be clean, and maybe you won't get the plague.
Going off of sort of the throwback sicknesses and those sorts of things, when I was reading, I was reading about Scarlet Fever, and I didn't expect to find this, but there are sort of sources as far back as Hippocrates. Am I saying that right?
Hippocrates.
Hippocrates.
Hippocrates? Yeah, whatever. Cool. That dude he
You sound like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Socrates.
Hippocrates. Yeah, no, he had noted basically early forms of scarlet fever, and this was thousands of years ago. Like, this was a long time ago. And so when I was researching scarlet fever, I found that there was several different periods of time where people got scarlet fever, and that actually hasn't even gone away today, that there are still thousands of people every single year that get scarlet fever, which is notable by your skin just becoming completely red all over you. It's essentially an advanced form of strep throat. So your throat starts to ache and just sort of starts to get these sores on it all the way down your throat. It's a bacterial infection, and it was originally called scarlatina. And the disease is actually the cause of the 1858 epidemic that killed about 95% of the children who it came in contact with. And that was kids ages 5 to 15, and then adults were not really impacted by that, other than losing their children. So,
Well, yeah.
Which is a pretty big deal, I would say. But George F. Dick was a man in the early 1900s who performed a test to see if people had scarlet fever or were susceptible to get scarlet fever. The test was actually named after him. Don't need to mention that. And
That's
so,
a rough one.
Yep, very interesting. So people would inject themselves with a small percentage of the bacteria, and it would, within 4 to 6 hours, either make their whole arm start to swell up and become red, or it would not impact them at all, and they would realize, oh, this person is not susceptible for scarlet fever. And don't know really what the purpose of that was, but thank you, George. We appreciate your work when it comes to this community.
That's like that reminds me of a tuberculosis test.
Yeah, the TB test.
Which I had convinced myself I had before I got that, so there were a lot of tears involved.
A lot of tears.
But I always kind of thought that was a more modern illness, so that's interesting that back to the time of Hippocrates.
Well, actually, smallpox was one of the first things that they started essentially inoculating against. In Turkey, they had started like taking, this is gross, like popping the pustules of smallpox and then like inserting it with like a needle or like a knife into somebody else to give them a milder form of the smallpox.
Yikes.
So that they would become inoculated into it. And it slowly developed until they, I believe it was cowpox. Like, it was easier to survive cowpox with it. So they would start, because they noticed that milkmaids were not getting smallpox.
Yeah.
And it turns out because they had become immune by being exposed to cowpox. So then and that kind of started the process of the idea of like vaccination. Like you had talked about, where they were trying to purposely infect people or to test people to see if they had a reaction.
Are we vaccinated for smallpox today?
No, we are
I
not.
didn't think so. That's the...
But our parents are.
If your parents have a round scar, right, a round scar on their arm, mine does as well, that's a smallpox vaccination, and they do not do that.
Want to know the last case of smallpox? 1977.
The last case ever in the world?
Yeah.
Wow.
Natural. The last natural case.
Oh, okay, so I guess that's why we're not vaccinated. I guess that makes sense. I was thinking you were going to say, like, 2018.
No. It was 1977, the last naturally occurring case of smallpox. I don't know what they meant by that, like if there had been purposeful... Because we do have vials of smallpox, and there is concern about biological weapons, because they...
Yikes.
Yeah.
Because none of us are vaccinated. They could weaponize it.
Right.
And, that's a whole generation gone. Because I don't even think you can just... Because you can go get some vaccinations. Like you've had yellow fever vaccination, right? Like, you can go get that if you're going somewhere that you'll be in.
But speaking of things that have been around for thousands of years, Ramesses V is the first concrete evidence we have of smallpox. His mummy had smallpox scars. And that shows us like the first concrete evidence of smallpox. And smallpox is the one that creates all those little pustules all over your body.
And you look like shiny in the photos. It looks like almost like white and shiny.
Yeah, they're pus-filled little... spots all over your skin, and it also does that on your inside as well.
Do they scar because people pop them?
Yes. Well, they scar in general.
They just scar.
So a lot of people throughout history have had it. Queen Elizabeth had it. Not the second, but the first.
Right. George Washington had it as well, didn't he?
I don't know about George Washington, but Abe Lincoln did.
Okay, maybe that's who I'm thinking of.
And he...
I never see that in the portraits.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing, is so many people had smallpox scars that in portraits they would overlook them. And they would edit them out because so many rulers had it. And I think up to... between like 120 years during its height, like 8 rulers died of smallpox.
Wow.
And there were instances, for example, in China, there was the choice to, I think it was the 3rd youngest son was given as king because he'd already had smallpox and survived. So instead of the eldest being appointed, they were worried he would die of smallpox. They were so worried about smallpox that they picked the kid who had had smallpox and survived to become the ruler.
That's crazy.
This podcast is a production of the Alderman Group and the Museum Center at 5 Points. Be sure to check out all our upcoming events on our website at museumcenter.org. That's museumcenter.org. Let's continue with the show.
And it's been all over the world, but the Crusaders really carried it back home with them, and it became an epidemic. Almost everyone had it by adulthood, kind of like the chicken pox, and then you were immune to it once you had it and survived it. One of the funny things, though, is things they thought would help.
I can't wait for this.
One Persian physician recommended bleeding someone until they fainted.
Oh boy.
Other solutions included drinking a potion of horse dung.
That ought to do it.
Or put a sick person next to the fire and close up all the windows so they would, like...
sweat it out.
Yeah.
Oh
Those sound super viable.
The color red was supposed to draw it out, so they would, like, paint the room red. They would put you in red pajamas. Wow. That was supposed to draw out the...
illness.
I just want to say, y'all call me extra, but, like, even I wouldn't go to those.
But the funny thing is, and I'm going to talk about another disease here real quick, is that we always say that we gave the New World all of these Old World diseases, and in return they gave us syphilis. Which might not be true. So this has been the general consensus for a long time, is that syphilis came from the New World. But I was actually watching a documentary where they found a medieval monastery with 3 individuals had like clear telltale signs of syphilis. Because syphilis is one of those diseases that can't actually be seen in the bones. So the bones that they found were characteristic of venereal syphilis. And this was actually in a monastery. It was in a, it was in England. And they were able to date the skeleton that had all these signs, these telltale signs that basically the experts all agreed this guy had syphilis. He was dated to the 1300s. With the latest possible carbon date at 1420, which is still 70 years before we supposedly had contact with the New World. This was a little bit older, so I'm wondering if it still did come from the New World by way of the Vikings, because we do know now that the Vikings were likely the first contact with the New World in 900.
Is that the Dark Ages?
Yeah. Yeah.
I won't even go into it here.
Oh boy.
I won't even
Hope
go
has
into
lots
it
of
here.
theories about the Dark Ages, so we won't get into those here.
One day
Not
we
yet.
will.
That is super interesting, because you always hear that syphilis was
A New World disease.
Napoleon had syphilis, right? Was it Napoleon that had syphilis? I keep throwing out all these names, but I'm really unsure. So I'm hoping that somebody
don't get
else will
sued
know.
for libel calling Napoleon
was
syphilitic.
supposedly just short.
He was
5'7".
He was average. He was way taller than I am. But I remember...
It's not an amazing feat.
Yeah.
That's also true. But no, I remember once again watching a show of some variety that had like rulers having syphilis because
Oh yeah.
they saw a lot of people, so they got syphilis. And I read something somewhere that like there was one city that like everyone had it almost like a lot. It was so common.
A lot of port towns had that issue.
I had kind of an interesting one that I had kind of wanted to talk about just because it was kind of the first where they were able to trace something. So it was 1854, Broad Street, our favorite city in London. So there was a cholera outbreak on Broad Street, and in total 616 people would die. So I know that throughout history there have been a ton of cholera epidemics. And it's, cholera is pretty characteristic. Like, you can look that up. So I don't have to get into what lets you know that you have cholera here, but
It's some pretty nasty details.
yeah, it's pretty gross. There's some movies about it. It happens in a lot of books.
Oregon Trail card game, dude.
Yeah, for real. Or the old game.
Yeah,
so it's transmitted by like bacteria and water. And there was this horrible outbreak in 1854 around this area of Broad Street, and a physician at the time, John Snow, said it was the most terrible outbreak to have occurred in the kingdom. Yes, that is also...
That was a Game of Thrones reference.
Yes,
I missed it.
His name was Jon Snow, but
I missed it, everybody.
that is also one of the main characters in Game of Thrones. Elijah was very confused.
That's like, I don't... no idea.
But the thing that was a little bit different about this particular cholera outbreak was that they kind of figured out where cholera came from. And
where this outbreak came from.
Yeah,
not cholera in general.
Well, they did sometimes think that cholera came from dirty air. That it was like airborne.
Miasma.
Yes, miasma. So cholera is not airborne. It comes from water. So John Snow, our esteemed physician here, used dot maps to figure out where everyone was dying, like where they lived, where they worked. And in doing this, he kind of found out, that there were 3 pumps, that water pumps, because in cities back then there would have been large pumps that you could go gather water from. And 2 of these pumps actually came directly from the Thames, which was also extremely dirty water, but apparently not this dirty. And then this Broad Street pump was a well that was dug, and it was about 3 feet away from a cesspit. And there were bodies, and there was a baby that had cholera. Its diapers were washed, and that transmitted into the water system.
Victorian sanitation, everybody.
Exactly. And they also found out that you could basically, brew cholera bacteria out of water, because the Broad Street Brewery, those workers got an allowance of beer, and they didn't get sick, because that water would have been, fermented into beer.
Well, I think it's been generally shown over the centuries, well, maybe except in ancient Rome, that it's safer to drink, beer and wine than it is to drink the water.
Except
for ancient Rome, where they did that in lead.
True.
They brewed it and fermented it in lead containers. But, barring that.
I mean, I can't even argue at this point. Set me up with that. But... I do think that it's kind of interesting that cholera was around for a really long time, and it took them that long to figure out, maybe it's the water.
It's waterborne, yeah.
Because I would think, wouldn't that water be kind of rank?
It'd be kind of...
Well, I'm pretty sure that was par for the course in
I guess
Victorian London.
That's true, and it's interesting. Just a fun fact about cholera, if you have type O blood, you're more likely to get it. So
Great.
Same.
Sorry.
So, yeah. That's just a fun fact. I mean,
Hope and I both have type O blood.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But you don't... Clearly, we talk about some interesting things in our office, guys. But you don't really have to worry about cholera so much, in the modern day. I mean, not in modern day America, at least. I don't think we've really had any outbreaks here. There have been some recently in other countries, but not on the scale of the last 6 or so that happened before about 1950, I think.
Yeah. One of the cool things about, Jon Snow, what you were saying, is that not Game of Thrones, everybody.
Dr. Jon Snow.
Doctor.
Dr.
The
Jon
doctor. Is that's still how, the CDC and the WHO today will do sort of investigations, is that they will sort of go around to wherever these outbreaks are happening, and then they will literally interview people, where have you been, what have you eaten over the last, weeks, and all sorts of things like that, in order to try and find the source, because, the world that we're in is so connected, so it could be a chicken, or it could be the water.
Like 7 degrees of separation, like we're all connected that way.
Yeah, it's super interesting how they still do that even today. They sort of plot these points of, okay, so it was connected here, let's sort of try to break it off right here. So
that's wild to think about, like in large cities, like trying to figure that out. Like,
yeah.
You must have to be extremely patient as well, because I don't remember what I did yesterday. So, well, I mean, yesterday I do remember, but like Sunday, I don't remember what I did Sunday.
So I think we had maybe 1 or 2 more case studies that we wanted to talk about. I know, Hope, you did some research on the Spanish flu, and we've also got the big one that we haven't touched on yet.
Yes, I will.
The elephant in the room.
I'll run through the Spanish flu super quickly. It was from 1918 to 1920. It's called the Spanish flu because this was during war times, and Spain wasn't super censorious, I guess, of their media. So you got more real reports because they were neutral.
Right.
And this might sound familiar to some of you guys. The Spanish flu strain was the H1N1, which, if you remember the swine flu pandemic of 2009, that was the same. But the Spanish flu is kind of wild. The death toll ranges from 17 to 50 million, but no one was actually reporting their real death tolls, so it could be up to 100 million people died.
Yeah, what I heard was that neither side of the war wanted to accurately report their death tolls from Spanish flu so that they didn't look weak.
Exactly.
To the other side, and that's why it's called Spanish flu, not because it originated there, but like you said, they were the only ones who were like willing to report on it because they didn't really have a stock in either side of the war.
Yeah, so
stake in either side of the war.
So we honestly have no idea like how many people died from it. And it's, I mean, kind of, a lot of people don't seem to remember this because there was a lot of other stuff going on at the time. It was the middle of a war. Yeah. The media wasn't reporting on it as much, but, and I hate to bring this up, but there was a super famous book that talked about one of their characters had Spanish flu. If you guys remember Twilight, that's how Edward Cullen was good. That's what was wrong with Edward Cullen. So, now maybe people will sort of look into that because that was a real illness, and he was about the age that would have died. And stop laughing at me and stop making faces.
Thank you, Stephanie Meyer, for bringing awareness to the Spanish flu.
Yes, that is fantastic job, girl. But yeah, I mean, it was true. He would have, in the book, he was 17. I have read these books. Everyone can just judge away. It's totally fine.
We're both the same age. One of us was a Twilight girl and one of us was not.
I wouldn't call myself a Twilight girl. I didn't watch all the movies. But
were you Team Edward or Jacob?
Jacob.
All right, that's fair. Elijah's
so confused.
No idea.
You have 10 days, so I'm sure you can find those movies.
Yeah, you're self-quarantined. Watch Twilight.
Plenty of time.
So I'll just kind of quickly run through a little bit of this. In 1999, researchers kind of put Etaples, hospital camp in France as maybe the center of this flu epidemic. There's a couple theories. This is one of them. Over 100,000 soldiers passed through there daily, and they had pigs and chickens, and they think that it could have spread from the chickens to then the pigs and then to humans. And it was like a huge hospital and everything. They were very close quarters, very close to each other in beds, and it would have basically spread like wildfire.
What year is that?
That was, in 1999 they said that.
Okay. Gotcha.
But this would have been, like, in 1917, they reported a new disease at this hospital with higher mortality rates, and they said that it was similar to the flu. It also could have come from Kansas. And it also, people say, could have come from China because people there weren't dying as much. There weren't as many people sick, and the flu season that year was kind of mild. But there's also kind of a lot of other things that people are saying. Like in 2009, there was a researcher called Karen Starko, and she said that this wasn't actually the flu, it was aspirin poisoning. Because that was when...
Pretty widespread.
So Bayer's patent on aspirin ran out that year. So the market was flooded with other aspirin.
Oh.
And it was kind of a suggested treatment for a lot of things. I think they said between 8 and 35 milligrams a day was kind of like a suggested treatment for basically any ailment. But as you guys know, the aspirin that we normally take now is about 50 milligrams. And I know like some people take them daily as blood thinners. So I'm not sure that that's super viable.
Aspirin may have also caused the Russian Revolution. Just fun fact, because Alexei, the Russian prince, was a hemophiliac. And Rasputin might have never gotten into power, except he was anti-medication, and one of the things that they might have used to treat Alexei, the prince of... was aspirin. But Rasputin was anti-medication, so when he came in and he said, don't give the kid aspirin, then he wasn't bleeding.
Yeah, so
now it seemed like Rasputin had these amazing powers to heal. And all of a sudden he was part of the Russian royal family, and that kind of destroyed
wild.
The image of the Romanovs in the eyes of the people. That's one of the big things. Just
that's
fun
really,
fact.
That's really interesting. And I have one more fun fact for you, and then we'll move on from
fun
the Spanish
fact about
flu.
Spanish flu. Let's go.
Yes. So, Don Juan was actually linked to the Spanish flu because of the song The Naples Soldier. That's what people in Spain called the flu, and it was just a really catchy song. I've never actually heard it, but I did write that down because I think it's interesting. So, yeah.
All right, let's take our last couple of minutes here and talk about the Black Death.
Oh, yes. Let's.
Also called the Bubonic Plague.
And there are actually 3 types of plague, but bubonic was the most common, I think. And you can still get this today, everybody.
So I have a really great quote that I wanted to mention here from somebody during the plague that happened in the 1300s, because there were several waves of the plague. And the plague doctor, by the way, didn't come around until the 1600s. But this one is... At every church they dug deep pits down to the water table, and thus those who were poor, who died during the night, were bundled up quickly and thrown into the pit. In the morning, when a large number of bodies were found in the pit, they took some earth and shoveled it down on top of them. And later, others were placed on top of them, and then another layer of earth. Just as one makes lasagna with layers of pasta and cheese.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, that's
very Italian way of putting the Black Death.
It
Just
really
as one
is.
makes lasagna.
It really is. And, I mean, the Black Death was, like, coming and going for a really long time.
Yes,
Like,
absolutely.
And we talked about this earlier. You can still get it today. I mean, it's pretty rare, and your chances of survival are relatively high. I think maybe 11% of people die, but that's a lot of times because they don't know what it is. So
Right.
they don't treat. But antibiotics will cure the plague as well.
Yeah, well, it was called the bubonic plague because you got these, like, swollen lymph nodes in your armpits, groin, and neck area that were kind of like black. They called them buboes, essentially. Black...
Is that why we say boo-boos today?
I have no idea.
That's a really good question, actually.
That is a good question.
She's got a little boo-boo.
But this was one of the things where they believed that miasma was the cause of the plague. And so that's why the plague doctors wore those masks, and people would have cloths over their mouths filled with herbs like rosemary and things like that.
That's where Ring Around the Rosie came from as well, isn't it?
Yeah. They also believed that animals were carriers of the plague, so they killed over 100,000 dogs and cats, which actually made it worse. And I'm talking about in the 1600s. They actually made it a lot worse because now we know it came from fleas that were on rats. The rats carried the plague. The fleas would bite the rat that had the plague and then bite humans with being plague infested and kind of put that into them. And cats, of course, are pest control for rats.
Yeah.
So by getting rid of, over 100,000 cats and dogs in the London area, they really helped facilitate the spread of the plague and got it really wrong.
Y'all, London's doing a lot better now. Like, let's just be real. Because it was, it was wild, and they didn't know what it was. Like,
they also believed syphilis would make you immune to the plague, so people would purposely try to get syphilis.
That's so extra.
Yeah.
Like, could you imagine trading one for the other?
Or for both?
Like, what
have both?
Exactly.
Like, yeah. So what did they do when they found out that syphilis didn't make you immune to the plague? But they, there were actually 3 types of plague that, we don't always talk about that, but bubonic was the most common and the most survivable. Then you had, like, a pneumatic, which would affect your lungs, and that was less survivable, and even today is less survivable.
And it was more contagious.
Yeah.
Because that could be airborne.
Then septicemic, which, like, even today you have pretty much a 100% chance of not surviving.
Yeah, that's of the blood.
Yeah. So that's... Ugh, y'all, I don't ever want plague. But...
me either. I also don't
that
want
swollen
plague.
lymph node that I had for a while, this I still have, by the way. Yeah.
More recently, there was actually bubonic plague that appeared in San Francisco's Chinatown in the early 1900s. It's called the San Francisco Plague of 1900, and there was only 121 cases, but out of those, 119 died. And the California governor actually pretended that it wasn't an issue and that nothing was happening, so that it wouldn't sort of... California was growing. There was lots of economic advances going on at the time, and so he didn't want anything to stop. And so he didn't mention it or say anything. And then there was a second occurrence, and then the government was like, we should probably quarantine these people and get this out there. They realized eventually that instead of rats this time, it was coming from the California ground squirrel. So lots of animals and lots of issues with eating animals and animals biting you and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah. Even more recently, during World War II, the Japanese tried to weaponize the plague. It was called Unit 731. It was located in China. And they would try to infect Chinese civilians or POWs with the plague. Or they tried to also create biological weapons by creating flea bombs that were infested with the plague. And they actually did end up killing, I think it was 20 to 30,000 people in the Chinese countryside of the plague by using these flea bombs and these experimentations.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I'll say that's kind of dark. Well, very dark, actually.
Down note to end on.
I know. Well, guys, thanks for hanging out with us today, and thanks for listening to us ramble about plagues. We hope that's topical for you. We hope that you find it interesting.
Wash your hands.
Wash your hands. Take a shower. Just because you're at home, please take a shower. But we'll be back next week, so I hope everybody has a good, safe...
Tune in next time.
Yeah.
Be sure to join us next time as we talk all things history and tell the story of the Ocoee region.
I'm learning history in Cleveland, Tennessee. Ocoee Society, 5 Points Museum, telling the story of our history, coming together as community. I'm learning history in Cleveland, Tennessee. Ocoee Society, 5 Points Museum, telling the story of our history, coming together as community. I'm learning history